Voting is such a crucial right that all of us have and hopefully exercise all the time. But it is something that's under attack. I'm going to introduce the panel by just introducing and saying their name and then letting them tell a little bit about themselves. But first I'm going to ask them a question. So you have the bios and you've probably read through those beautiful bios. We have a great panel here. They look good, right? So Ari's book. So, you know, when you're going to moderate a panel, of course you read the book, so they could be saying something that you really disagree with, right? But so I started this book, and I'm like, okay, I'm on a plane, and I started the first page, and before I knew it, I couldn't put it down. It's very much like, it reads like a fiction, but it's all about history. And it's all about things that we should have ingrained in our head. When I was at Westchester University, I taught a course called Race Relations. This would be a must-read. This would be a must-read if I was a high school educator, because this is exactly what's under attack. And so, Ari Berman, I'm going to introduce you first, and I'm going to ask you the question. You know, a lot of this is history, but when I read the papers, it's not.
Yeah.
And my question to you is, you know, if you don't understand your history, you repeat your mistakes.
Yeah.
So what must we do not to repeat those mistakes?
Well, thank you so much for the kind words, and thank you so much to Chris for organizing this and for having me, and I'm delighted to be here with all of you. So 51 years ago this week, Congressman John Lewis and 600 marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, and were brutally beaten by Alabama state troopers on what became known as Bloody Sunday. And that event, more than any other, led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. It happened on March 7th, 1965. So this week will be the 51st anniversary of that Bloody Sunday March, and it was depicted in the film Selma, which I'm sure many of you saw, and I was really curious to see Selma because I was in the process of finishing my book and had studied this history so closely. And what I realized after Selma came out was that so many people didn't know the history of Bloody Sunday. They didn't know that people like John Lewis nearly died. In some cases, people did die. People like Jimmy Lee Jackson, Viola Liuzzo, and Jonathan Daniels did die for the right to vote, for something that everyone just takes for granted as something that they inherently have, but didn't realize that so many people did not have that right historically and paid such a high price for it. And so what I realized is that if people didn't know about Bloody Sunday, which was something that got an enormous amount of press and has been chronicled multiple times in books like Taylor Branch's trilogy about Martin Luther King. If they didn't know about Bloody Sunday, then they certainly didn't know what happened after Bloody Sunday, the 50 years that occurred after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So that's really why I wanted to write in my book, because it's the history of voting rights since 1965. So it's about everything happened after the Edmund Pettus Bridge, after a Bloody Sunday, and that is not really taught in the history books. We know that there were all of these pivotal events in the Civil Rights era that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, not just in Selma, but of course in places like Mississippi and Georgia and all across the South. But we're told this narrative where it seems like there's either this climax of the Civil Rights Movement with the Edmund Pettus Bridge and the passage of the Voting Rights Act, or there's the death of the Civil Rights Movement in 1968 with the death of Martin Luther King. And I knew that the voting rights struggle didn't end in Selma in 1965. I knew that it didn't die in 1968 with Martin Luther King, that there was a lot that happened in the decades since. And you're absolutely right that when you read the newspaper, and if it's even in the newspaper, but when you read the newspaper, that this story is reoccurring in very disturbing ways, because what has happened, just to give a big picture overview, is since the 2010 election, 21 states have new voting restrictions in effect. So things like making it harder to register to vote and shutting down voter registration drives, cutting back on the amount of time people have to access the ballot, so cutting back on things like early voting, which made voting more convenient, requiring strict forms of ID to cast a vote that you never needed before in any previous election, and that a significant percentage of registered voters, particularly voters of color, don't have. Purging the voting rolls, disenfranchising ex-felons. We saw all of these efforts really proliferate after the 2010 election, and not just in the South, not just in places like Alabama and Mississippi, but in places like Ohio and Wisconsin and Iowa that did not have the same history when it came to voting rights. So that's how I began to cover the struggle over voting rights. And then in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act and ruled that those states with the longest histories of voting discrimination, the Alabamas, the Georgias, the Mississippis of the world, no longer had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. So as a result, the 2016 election is the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. So we have to go all the way back to 1964 when Barry Goldwater was the Republican nominee to find an election without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. And many of the states that voted in Super Tuesday yesterday had some of these new restrictions, places like Texas and Alabama and Georgia. So I am concerned that this debate has resurfaced again. That is really one of the main reasons why I wanted to write my book, and I think it's very important to have this conversation now so people know what their rights are, so you can mobilize communities, and we can talk about this issue because there have been 16 presidential debates so far, and the issue of voting rights has not come up. So I think this is being treated much more as a fringe issue than a fundamental issue. There's been so much talk about who is winning states, what the polls say, but much less attention to the most fundamental aspect of the election, which is will every eligible voter actually be able to cast a ballot. So I am looking at the election from a very, very different lens than how much of the media is covering it.
Thank you, Harry. So Jason, what I just heard, it scares me because, you know, for President Obama, you were there registering people, and now there's no protection, and the rules have changed. So if I were to anoint you as the national person who is going to really go out here and get people registered to vote, what would you say and how would you get us there?
Absolutely. Good morning. My name is Jason Green. Thank you for that question. Thank you to Chris and Dr. Lewis for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I really appreciate it to be here with my co-panelists. If Ari's overview there didn't mobilize us and incite us, I'm not exactly sure what would, quite candidly. I was the National Voter Registration Director for the 2008 Obama campaign, where we were tasked with registering and mobilizing millions of new participants in this wonderful democracy that we have and that we need to fight to protect. And many of you, I imagine, participated in that 2008 election in one way or another, engaged in that very epic registration effort, and I thank you for that. And I think that, you know, the conversation here is around the role, potential role of social workers in empowering and mobilizing, again, many to the ballot. And I think that what our strategy in 2008 around voter registration is a useful mobilization tool. President Obama and then Senator Obama is a very captivating candidate and obviously inspired much in all of us that participated in that campaign. But that inspiration alone would not have allowed us to build an organization or an operation to actually mobilize the number of people that came to the polls. Instead, what we needed to do was to create space for other people to begin to organize their own communities. Because I think we all know that that's where real foundational change occurs. It occurs at the ground level and rises to the top. You know, one thing that I remember from that campaign, and you probably heard quite regularly, was the president in a speech would say, the senator would say, one voice could change a room. You guys remember this? One voice can change a room, and one room can change a town. One town can change a city, and one city can change a state. And one state can change a country, and one country can change the world. And when he would give that speech, you would see people get very excited because they thought that he was talking about himself, and he wasn't. He was talking about each individual in that room and their inherent ability to motivate those that are around them. And so the organizing tactic that we used was to empower individuals in their own communities to build neighborhood teams to again, create that space, engage their neighbors, and then mobilize to vote. Voter registration wasn't just a means to an end. We obviously needed to register enough people to win. That was a goal. But voter registration is also a voter activation tool. We know that people, when they engage in democracy in that way, when they're giving that gift to another individual to participate, that they themselves are more likely to turn out, that they themselves are more likely to continue to participate in civic engagement. And so we used voter registration not just as a mechanism, as a means to be successful on Election Day, but as a mechanism to build those teams in their communities that were going to affect change on Election Day, but then continue to be able to affect change going forward. And so, that organizing tactic, as I was reminded this morning by one of your colleagues, is called the snowflake method, where in individual communities, leaders are empowered to build teams. Those teams are given the space and the autonomy and the focus and tools to incorporate those organizing principles in their community. And as additional people join, those teams grow, but it's shared responsibility. It's not an effort that one individual is expected to hold the entire weight. It's a team effort that's allowing other individuals to become and get involved and move that goal forward.
Thank you. So Tanya, people come to your institute, and are you surprised about their lack of knowledge about the political process, or would you say that they're astute about the political process? And then, I say this is an urgent matter, so what do people need to know about how knowledgeable the base really is?
Thank you, and thanks to Chris for inviting me. I'm sorry I'm not Nancy Humphreys, but I can speak to the work that we're doing at the Institute, and that is really, we're at the University of Connecticut School of Social Work, and we are really trying to make the case that voting is social work, and the important connection that civic participation and individual and community health, that they are intimately related, and that not only is voting social work, but social workers should be working on nonpartisan voter engagement as part of every social worker's professional practice. So yes, we find that, one, they don't know this history. I'd love to see this, and we do teach political social work, and so and students often say, I had no idea because I didn't learn this in school, and so I think that would be a motivating factor. But you also, we've gone at it a long time by saying this is something you should do. There's this moral argument, everyone should be doing nonpartisan voter engagement work, but it hasn't really moved. So we've partnered with Nonprofit Vote, working with some larger national organizations that are framing it as part of the benefits of voting being a critical part of community health and individual health. I mean, the outcomes for the practice of voting are higher in areas like employment and mental health and health. And so trying to get social workers to understand that this is really part of the work that we should be doing and motivating them. And so we are doing some pilot programs with the University of Nevada and University of Connecticut to embed some of this voter education, this nonpartisan voter engagement work into classrooms, into required courses, and then giving them an assignment, because there's this piece, voter engagement is not just, and when it's theoretical, it's hard. You can say, oh yes, I should be doing it, but then you go to register someone to vote, and it's not that easy, it's intimidating, it's complicated, every state is different, the whole thing is intimidating. So then we give them an assignment to take it to their field. And we're trying to understand, we know the barriers for organizations, nonprofit organizations can be doing this work and should be doing this work. It's legal on a nonpartisan basis, but you get field supervisors who say, you know what, we're not political. You get organizations that say, we're not political, that's not part of what we do. And we're trying to empower students to say, you know what, we want to have this conversation. Why aren't we doing this work in our organization? And and also looking at it not just from a registration, but what does it mean to be educated? What do people need to know to go to the polls? And then what do they need? When is the voting? I mean, even the process of voting, primaries are on different days. There's rules. I mean, it's meant to be complicated. So I think this is a critical part of social work, and that's what we're trying to, yes, we're surprised all the time. People have no idea.
Thank you. And Khaliyl, you're last but not least. And I left you over there because I tagged him a millennial, and I learned a lot about millennials over the last couple of days. And so I really do understand, and I learned a lot more about millennials and this social stuff. How do we keep people engaged in the classroom to understand how important this is, as well as that they have to go through the tedious part in order to get to the smart part?
So I think the basis of your question is how do we engage millennials?
Yes, well, thank you. That's millennials for you, right?
And that's valid. And I think that's $1 million question, which has now become $1 billion question. We're certainly not the only people asking this question throughout the nation. It's been a topic of conversation for some time now, for the past 50 years or so. Just to start with the work that I do, I work in the Senate, and I work for Senator Blumenthal, and I work on policy. And I would argue that policy, for better or for worse, is behind many of the events that take place in this country. And as a millennial, I also believe strongly that we're issue-oriented folks. Society tries to peg us as folks that aren't really engaged, don't really care about the issues that are really going on, but I refuse to believe that. And I think, campaigns like Bernie Sanders, Barack Obama have really engaged folks, especially millennials, through advents of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, things like that, in really paying attention to the issues that are facing people across the country. So in the classroom, my recommendation would be to use this issue-oriented approach that we know millennials, or at least I believe strongly that millennials follow, and engage them in the classroom on current events, things that are going on. Let's engage them in conversation not only on the dramatic violent side of what's going on in Ferguson, but let's talk about the housing policies and the criminal justice reform issues that have taken place in Ferguson that have led to this violence. Let's make sure that we're attaching policy to these issues, these current events that are taking place. Flint water crisis. Let's talk about issues where there's been policies in place that privatized organizations have come in, and let's make sure that people in classrooms understand how if you don't vote for your governor, if you don't vote for your state rep, if you don't vote for your state senator and get involved, this stuff will happen. Presidential elections are important, but we need to make sure we're focusing, as John said, on our state and localities. So I would say, to just put it simply, issue-oriented approach in the classrooms. Let's make sure we're tying things together, and I think you'll find that it'll really stick and resonate with folks to make their own independent decisions on things. Because if there's another thing I know about millennials, they like autonomy, and I think that allows them to make their own decision on it. And again, thank you, Chris, for inviting me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's a great opportunity to discuss something that is critically important moving forward.
So at this point in the program, we're not going to editorialize and carry this out. What we're going to do is to ask you to interact with us. So we'd like you to ask questions of the panel. I believe that really drives the conversation to where we want to go. And if somebody asks about the color of their suit, I will stop that question. But as long as it stays relevant, I think that it's very important to hear from you and what you want to know from this esteemed panel. So we have people in the room that are going to walk the floor. The one area you addressed one question that I just want, and then I know it's your turn, to get back to you all, that there are those who are uneducated that do not know the power of the vote. But then there are those that are educated that do know the power of the vote. Why do they want to stay apart?
Yeah. Well, I'll just start. So it's really interesting if you look at both the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s and those that were on the opposite sides, those that were trying to preserve the structure of white supremacy, they both understood in the same way the power of the vote. And that's why this was such an intense struggle. The title of my book, Give Us the Ballot, comes from the first major speech that Martin Luther King gave about the right to vote in 1957 at the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom in Washington. This was in many ways the precursor to the March on Washington. It happened 6 years earlier. It was at the Lincoln Memorial. About 25,000 people showed up, which was a huge gathering then. And the march happened, well, the prayer pilgrimage for freedom happened in 1957 for two reasons. One, that was when Congress was considering the first civil rights bill of the 20th century. So the first time, it was a modest bill, but the first time that people like Lyndon Johnson were faced with actually having to vote for civil rights. But the other reason why the march happened in 1957 was this was the 3rd anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And many people, like John Lewis, believed that the South would change after Brown versus Board of Education, that schools across the South would desegregate. But after the Brown decision, nothing changed. Nothing changed. All of the schools that were segregated remained segregated. And the question was why? Because those schools were controlled by white conservative politicians from the school board level to the state legislative level to the senatorial level who did not want the system to change. And so King said, give us the ballot, because he knew that the vote was ultimately what would give people the power to change their circumstances. The vote was going to be what made schools desegregate. The vote was going to be able to make you be able to eat where you wanted, to marry who you wanted, to sleep with who you wanted, and ultimately to elect who you wanted. And so they realized in 1957 that the vote was so important. People obviously knew that for decades, but this was the time to sort of go public with that strategy. And then it took 8 years to get the Voting Rights Act after that. So it took a tremendous amount of work just to get the Voting Rights Act. You're talking about all the things that happened before that, not just the Brown decision, but the freedom rides and the sit-ins and Mississippi Freedom Summer, all of which culminates in the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And so when I talk about the struggle since 1965, I look at it in two different ways. One is this narrative of revolution, how we got someone like John Lewis to be the conscience of the Congress, how we got President Barack Obama. All of these events were made possible by the Voting Rights Act, but not just the high-profile events that really all across the country, places have integrated and democratized for the first time because of the Voting Rights Act. And I really think that was a legitimate American revolution if you look at what the structures of government across the country looked like before 1965. But I think there's also been a counter-revolution against the progress, that people studied what happened in American history, how, for example, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, people were emancipated. And there were black senators and governors from places like Louisiana and Mississippi, something that we haven't seen since then. And there were 22 African-American members of Congress from the South. But then federal officials left. And we began to see things like poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses and property requirements. And the idea was that this progress is not inevitable. We can step backwards dramatically if we lose the political will to enforce a civil rights consensus. And so I think what we're facing now is a modified version of that strategy. They call the reaction to Reconstruction the redemption of the South. And I think to some extent after the election of President Obama, we saw another version of a redemption when we saw a whole lot of people in 2010 with signs that said, take our country back. Take our country back where? I don't want to get too political, but when people say make America great again, what America are they talking about? What America are they talking about? They don't think that the America of Barack Obama is great. They have another America in mind. So I think that those opponents of the civil rights movement, and we'll talk about them later, but people like Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion of the Voting Rights Act, they didn't just wake up one morning and decide to do this. There has been a 50-year effort in the conservative movement to try to roll back the Voting Rights Act and try to roll back the gains of the civil rights movement, because both sides know acutely how powerful the vote is.
So what we'd like you to do is to stand up, state your name, but wait till the microphone is on, so that, because it's being taped. Angela, right here.
Hello, my name is Michael Robinson. I'm from the University of Georgia. And my question is for Ari and the rest of the panel, and you touched on it later on just recently. The rhetoric surrounding the current primaries, I'd just like to get to know your opinion. You mentioned we want to make America great again, take our country back. And without being political, I just want to know the panel's reaction to the rhetoric surrounding the primaries.
You want to go first? Then I'll go in because I don't want to monopolize it.
Yeah, I'm going to totally avoid that question and talk about something else that I want to talk about.
I'll answer.
And then I'll leave that for Ari, who's non-political answer. No, what I heard a lot of what Ari was answering, I'm hearing a lot about sort of the role of politics in this conversation, right? And obviously, I come from a political background. You know, in 2008, I led our voter registration efforts for a Democratic candidate. The takeaway from that, for me, is that you should feel very empowered to participate in this process, because what you're having are two political parties, two political processes that are driving the efforts of voter registration and voter turnout. And not surprisingly, those two parties, and soon to be those two candidates, will be motivated by political outcomes. And so, you know, I can talk disparagingly about myself and our efforts. We are going to lead and put forward the issues that are favorable to our candidate. And you know, that will happen with every political party. That means a lot of information, a lot of issues are being left out. A lot of what you care about, a lot of what is at the core of the heart of being a social worker is not going to be discussed. And so when you talk about the fight for, over the last 50 years, to push back against some of the erosion of the Voting Rights Act, you don't hear a lot of that effort being led by the political parties. There are different nonprofit movements that were organized and spearheaded those efforts. And so what I would encourage this group to realize is that it's very important for you to be involved, yet again, to push these efforts forward. When a political campaign thinks about voter registration, they think about voting, they think about who are the pool of people that are going to likely turn out. Which percentage of those people are going to vote for me? And then what is the minimum amount of effort do I need to expend to get those people to the polls? That's the political process. That's not the way to have the majority of Americans engaged civically, to engage in that community health that Tanya was talking about. And so we desperately need in our quote unquote political process others that are focused on sort of the entirety of our communities in our country to ensure that people are engaged.
Can I add one piece to that? It is the people who are non-voters are being left out. I mean, if you have a high propensity to vote for a candidate, you're obviously getting a door knock and somebody's going to reach out to you. But a lot of the people that we care about in the communities that we serve are not getting those robocalls. They're not getting those people knocking on their doors. And so that's why we really believe that social work can have a huge impact through nonprofits, because there have been studies showing that, when you reach out, when you're asked to vote by somebody that you trust, you are more likely to go out and vote. And when nonprofits, there was a study, Nonprofit Vote did a study, quite a large-scale study, and they were able to shrink the gap in very important demographic groups that we care about. I mean, people of color, low-income voters, and younger voters. So I think that's the other piece that we really have to be thinking about as social workers, getting everybody, looking at everybody, because the political parties are not.
So the Republican strategist Lee Atwater, who was the mastermind behind the Willie Horton campaign in 1988 that arguably won George H.W. Bush the election over Michael Dukakis, he once talked about the evolution in terms of the language against civil rights. And he said, you start out by talking about the N-word, which is what politicians openly did in the 1950s and the 1960s. And then you start to get more subtle. Start to talk about things like busing and integration and affirmative action in the late 60s and the early 70s. Then you start talking about things like taxes and spending and big government in the 1980s. And by then you're so abstract that people don't even think you're talking about race, when race is underlying your entire message. So the point was that you had to start talking in code words. Trump is not talking in code words. He's thrown out the entire subtlety of the Southern strategy. He is openly talking about deporting 11 million people. He is openly talking about not allowing Muslims into the country. He is openly questioning the citizenship of our first black president. There are no code words here. It's all out in the open. And you see who is flocking, whether he disavows them or not, based on if he can hear them in his earpiece. We see who is flocking to his campaign. And so this is very disturbing to me, because people say, well, there's no precedent for this. There's a lot of precedent for this. Just not that long ago. I mean, I can give you many, many precedents for what we're hearing now, whether it was Goldwater in '64, or George Wallace in 1968, or Richard Nixon in 1968, or Ronald Reagan kicking off his campaign for the presidency in Neshoba County, Mississippi in 1980, where the civil rights activists Goodman, Cheney, and Joyner were murdered by the Klan, and Reagan going to a huge all-white fair and saying, "I believe in states' rights." I can give you that as a precedent. I can give you Jesse Helms and Strom Thurmond and the Tea Party and Sarah Palin, all of these precedents. And so I think what we're seeing in the 2016 election is people feeling that the system is rigged. A consensus on both sides that the system is rigged. Then the question is, what do you do about it if you believe that the system is rigged? Do you blame Muslims and Hispanics and those that are disenfranchised and marginalized for rigging the system, which is what one side is doing? Or do you say that the system is rigged because we have a campaign finance system that allows people to buy in elections, and we have a voting system that allows people to win elections by making it harder for certain people to vote, and we have an economic system that it seems like, regardless of who is president, keeps generating the same kind of outcomes? And so the narrative about how the system is rigged is so dramatically different if you were to go to a Donald Trump rally, or you were going to go to a Bernie Sanders rally. And so to me, it's an open question of who's going to win this argument. And then I think that this is something that all of you in the room can play a really constructive role in, because you are interacting with the system all the time, and you are seeing in many ways how it is rigged. But you're also seeing that it's probably not people coming in from Syria and people coming in from Mexico and people who have historically been disenfranchised that have rigged the system. It's probably people that are a lot more powerful that have a lot bigger say in terms of what goes on. And so that's why I think the 2016 is both an alarming moment, but I also think can be, if handled right, push in a much more constructive and progressive direction.
So I'm going to do like my friend John here and avoid the political aspect of that question. But I would like to add a 2 cents on a millennial perspective. You know, a lot of people argue that millennials are disenchanted with the political system, like Ari was inferring with his remarks. And they believe our political system is broken and it's what's wrong with the country. And I think that has bred or has made millennials really strive for a transformative and fresh take on the political system. Traditional politics don't really spur too much millennial movement in this area. But, you know, the important thing to note is that, you know, you're not always going to have a transformative and captivating, you know, candidate like Barack Obama. You're not going to have a forthright and consistent feel the burn movement. You know, these are offshoots of, you know, the political system kind of rearranging itself towards you know, millennial desires and things like that. So I think what we can do as social workers, what do we have? We have empathy, and we have an ability to connect with people from all segments of society. And that puts us in a unique position to go into these communities and say, hey, you know, again, to get back to state and localities, this is impacting you're impacting your community. This is impacting your housing situation. This is impacting your taxes. This is impacting this and that and the third. And we can really bridge the gap for folks and act as a conduit of information to not so much translate, because these people understand the issues that they're faced by, but they may not be privy to the policy behind it and things like that. So I think what we're seeing in the campaigns that are currently before us is just a lot of folks that are angry, frustrated, and almost confused with the state of our political system. So, yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
Community organization. Community organization is back. You know.
I'm a community organizer. I'm all about it.
All
So.
right. Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Deborah Warford, and I'm I'm proud senior at Coppin State University in the social work department. I am a baby boomer social worker working with millennial clients. So there's a major gap for me, major gap. You know, I grew up where I witnessed the dogs attacking the voters and all of that good stuff. And now I'm working with clients who biggest concern is where's their next meal coming from, where they're going to sleep at. My population that I choose to work with is 18 to 24-year-old, those who are aging out the foster care system or older homeless youth that they call them. And they have no desire at this point in time. I guess you would call them millennials?
Millennials.
Okay.
You can use that.
Well, they have no desire to even think about the political process because they have nowhere to sleep, nowhere to eat, nowhere to bathe. How do you encourage them to participate in a process that, as you can say, that's corrupt? They do not see the need, the whole overall picture of that affects your home, that it does affect your eating. So I'm in a struggle because all I can see, you know, when I ask you to register to vote, and I call it Activate the Vote campaign that I started back home, where it's a 3-part, you register them to vote, you educate them, not only on the candidates, because people don't realize, I know in Baltimore City we have ballot issues that has a financial piece to it. And then you try to get them to the polls, which we don't do anymore. You know, we say, oh, there's your poll over there. And we're part of that place where they change a lot of the polls in the city of Baltimore. And our school is it was in the middle of the Freddie Gray uprising. So you have that whole community that is just, will tell you in a minute, vote for what? For whom? There's nobody, they have if Barack Obama could run again, they would probably vote for him. But right now, they do not see anyone, no one, including Donald Trump, as charismatic or whatever he may be, that does not excite them. So how can I, as a baby boomer, encourage the millennials to get out and vote?
Yeah. Again, the billion-dollar question. But no, that was excellent and well said. And like I said, I think it's important to really understand that this is the most diverse generation we've ever really seen in America. I mean, there's 83.1 million millennials, and I don't know how many of you have known this, but they have now outnumbered the baby boomers. Yes. So I think they're more than a quarter of the population. We got a couple clappers over here. Yeah, exactly. So, and I'm getting to that point, and I think it starts in the classroom, and I mean, we can get to.
All right.
That's where I'm getting.
Okay.
So education reform is a really important tool and something that Congress can take a lead on and has with ESSA. And I think we can even go further and really to put these civics classes in places that attach real current events that kids can understand. And I think as young people and as leaders on this issue, I think conversations like this are important. They need to see someone their age that is as engaged on this issue as the baby boomers are. Because they don't think they have any stake in the fight. But really, they wield just as much power as the baby boomers, and as I said, if not more at this point. And I think another important thing to think about is half the battle is getting these folks registered to vote. Yeah. And let's consider policies out there like in Oregon and California with automatic voter registration. When they go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, they'll sign up for their license, they'll automatically get registered to vote. It's been wildly successful in Oregon. I mean, in a 6-month or 6-week period, rather, they were able to sign up 10,000 registrations. It's crazy compared to the 2,000 that they normally register over a 2-month period. You'll get into a partisan conversation pretty quickly when you start talking about automatic voter registration, and I'll leave that to Ari. But
I'm nonpartisan.
and Jason. But I think that's an important start, and I think it starts with, one, education in the classrooms. Education reform is something that's critically important to the country. And I think also getting folks registered and looking for new and progressive ways to do that.
I'm glad you mentioned automatic registration because 80% of those that were registered voted in 2012. The problem was that 50 million Americans weren't even registered to vote. A quarter of Americans aren't registered to vote right now. So a quarter of society is just going to sit out the election, regardless of who the candidates are. And I think that's really alarming. And certainly getting people registered, you still have to get them out to vote, but at least they would be in the system, and they would be a much easier step to get them activated. It's interesting that you mentioned Baltimore, because one of the people, as you know, running for mayor of Baltimore is DeRay McKesson, who was a leader of the Black Lives Matter movement and was in Ferguson and was in Baltimore and was in all of these places and grew up in Baltimore. And it was surprising that he decided to run for mayor. And I don't know if he thinks he can win or not. I haven't talked to him about it. But my sense was that he decided to run because he wanted to channel some of the energy in the Black Lives Matter movement into electoral politics so that people could see that people like him were stepping out, that the system could change, that voting did matter. Because there is a whole conversation among the activists in places like Ferguson and Baltimore of whether voting matters in the first place. Because look at Baltimore, for example. It's controlled by Democrats. It's not controlled by people who are descendants of white supremacy. But things aren't changing, you know, in the way that they would like to see. And so I think that, you know, the next generation, the millennial generation, people like DeRay are stepping up to show that the system can work, that it can work better. I'm just curious, Jason, when you were working for the Obama campaign, this must have come up all the time. Why does voting matter? What was your pitch for the president to try to get people to the polls?
I think you know, one of the pieces that we keep hitting on here is that voting is more than casting a ballot on an election day. I think that's what we were trying to instill in folks, is that we were trying to inspire people to engage in their communities again, to talk to their neighbors again, to realize that sometimes you don't feel like the elected political process works for you, but again, change comes from the ground up, not from the top down. And so we want to provide places and opportunities for that sort of organization and change to occur. And so that's why I want to, you know, really give credit to you for the work that you're doing with those young people. And I know that it can be discouraging because today they may not be too inspired to go out and vote, but that you can't let that discourage you. Those efforts need to continue. As we mentioned earlier, you know, education here is important. Reform in the education system, but we are all educators, each one of you. And so you take that power in every conversation that you have with those young people to inform them about what Ari's written about, the information that's happened over the last 50, but you can go back 150 years, about the efforts that to win that right to vote and how important it is. But candidly, we meet people where they are. And those social services need to be there to help them as well. And perhaps the way to engage them is to empower them to get the social services that they deserve. You know, through the National Voter Registration Act, the Motor Voter Act. You know, to our point about automatic registration, in every place where you get a driver's license, in many of these social service agencies, there should be automatic registration. There isn't. It was one of the issues that I took on the Obama campaign. We had Operation Open Doors, where I was on the phone with secretaries of state across the country. But that doesn't need to be a political campaign. That could be your young people making sure that Baltimore and other communities are engaging with their citizens the right way, and they'll start to feel that civic engagement. They'll start to see that change, and maybe they start to be the peer for their peer group to empower them to vote.
Hello, I'm Brendan Young. I'm a social worker from Philadelphia. And I think in the current election cycle, we're hearing a lot about campaign finance, and we're hearing a lot about sort of raising a good question: who holds our elected officials' ears? So I'm wondering, not only after the process of Election Day, how do we continue to engage individuals to be involved in the political process and to hold their elected officials accountable?
Well, I think that one of the biggest mistakes of the Obama presidency, I want to get your response to this, was having millions of people that wanted to be engaged and then taking things in the back room. and not giving all of those supporters something that they could constructively do. And I know there were efforts like Organizing for America that kept people engaged, but it wasn't the same level of engagement on the campaign. And so often, whether it was the financial crisis or healthcare reform, the thing was, let the professionals handle it. Let the people in the back rooms, let Tim Geithner handle it. Let Max Baucus handle it, as opposed to all of these people feeling like they were still engaged in government. So to me, that was one of the biggest missed opportunities of the Obama presidency, even though I think that the president has done many, many, many good things and that he does not get enough credit for. So I think that if the system changed, people would feel more accountable even after the election. Because if you're elected, for example, with a lot of small donors under a public financing system, those are the people you're going to go back to if you're running for re-election, as opposed to just trying to get the biggest check you can from a super PAC. But I also think that it's not just the campaign finance system; it's the lobbying system that people are so often not meeting with social workers, but they are meeting with those people representing the most powerful corporations. And so I think if we made our campaign finance system more responsive, if we made the drawing of the districts, quite frankly, more competitive and more fair, because right now both parties are usually just concerned about their own primary and their own base, as opposed to trying to win a general election, because there's so few competitive seats, then people would have more of an incentive to try to reach out to differing constituencies. And then I think, just in terms of a philosophy, having a philosophy where you actually believe that people matter after the election is really important. President Obama said that. I think he believed it, but there wasn't always an effort to get it done. I think Bernie Sanders has talked about it too, about a political revolution. We haven't necessarily seen a lot of evidence of a political revolution occurring. Quite frankly, turnout on the Democratic side has been down relative to 2008. So if we're going to see this revolution, we have to see a lot more people turning out to make it a reality.
The only thing I'll add, I absolutely sort of second the point about sort of political gerrymandering. It just leads to a less representative electoral politics. And I think it's also led to a much more professional politic, right? Right now we have many more, sort of absent Donald Trump on the Republican side, everyone that's running is sort of a professional politician. And that trickles down through the Senate, through the House. And that can lead to sort of less representative politics. I think if you're able to move away from some of those protected districts, you're getting greater representation in our House and in our Senate, which is supposed to be sort of the most representative branch of our government. And there, the president, but also sort of those in the legislative branch, are able to be engaged. I mean, that sustained engagement, candidly, it's hard, right? It's much easier to drive towards a day every 4 or 2 or 6 years, right? You can focus all your efforts. We can all take a breath the day after. That sustained engagement is very difficult. It's very necessary for a representative democracy, but it's very difficult. And so I think it would be hard to think about sort of just the presidency or the executive branch being that engagement mechanism, where we have these 525 other members of Congress who are much closer to their constituents that should be making asks. Yeah. That's the problem, right? We're not asking enough of our citizenry. What do we ask, and how do we give sort of some element of finiteness to that ask so that you feel like you're actually engaged in your democracy? I think that's the challenge, where we need to be a little bit more creative about how we engage with each other.
Charles, I want to make a statement. And then I have a question. The statement is, I find it difficult doing this work in a nonpartisan fashion, because when I want people to go to the polls, I know who I want them to vote for. Okay, so it's, I find that, for me, how we're going to do this. So actually, we incorporated CRISP as a 501c4, which allows us to be partisan if we choose. But in working with other social work organizations, we have to kind of, find a way to do. So I just wanted to make make that statement. Now, my question is, so Bernie Sanders has obviously captivated young people, okay? And you know, there have been different reasons given. Okay, the Republicans say they want the free stuff. They want the free education and all that. Or the other thing is that it's just an expression of their anti-establishment sentiment. All right, so if that's the case, if Bernie Sanders does not prevail, where do they take that energy? Because they can only take it back to the establishment.
Tanya, did you pass that question on?
Well, no, I just didn't.
Turn the mic down.
I was definitely deferring. I mean, I don't know what to do with the anger. I will tell you, though, that I think that it's a lot easier to have conversations and to drive people's frustrations to the local level. So to your question, how do I get involved? It feels really intimidating although very accessible. When you call Senator Blumenthal's office, they will meet with you in a second. They will come to your organization. I mean, I think that politicians actually and elected officials understand that they're there because of people are voting for them. And they don't drive huge gobs of money home now with you know, the spending. So constituent services has become a really important thing, and I'll let you speak to that because that's your expertise. But I think they're very accessible. And when you talk to folks at the state level in the state legislature, we have an elected social worker from my town. Her first 6 months in office, she got not one phone call from a constituent.
Yeah.
Not one. Yeah. So we are missing a huge opportunity to engage people, and I think when you can get them touching the system on a local level, they feel more empowered on a national level, and they start to see the importance of doing that. And I think perhaps maybe that's the answer to channeling some of the anger, but I'm going to let people who know more than me talk about that.
I think that was a point that I wanted to make too, and I'm glad you raised it, Tanya, was that there's so much focus on the presidential level and then secondarily on the Senate and then on the Congress that people miss that, especially with Washington gridlock, the action is in the states. That it was these red states that made it harder to vote, that shut down Planned Parenthood and people's access to health care, that have gone after unions. That's all happened in the states without Congress lifting a finger by state legislatures and by governors. And many of these state legislative officials, they're not elected by that many votes. And so if you begin to mobilize, you can dramatically change the composition of the states. And then obviously local levels matter a lot. You look at Ferguson, for example. The local government in Ferguson mattered tremendously in terms of the situation that you had there. If you changed that local government, you would have a completely different criminal justice system there, where you wouldn't only have 3 African-American cops out of 53 people on the force, for example. You wouldn't have essentially criminalization of people of color to fund the county and local government. So I think that not just state representation, but local representation matters a lot too. In terms of, Charles, your question about where do you put this energy, I mean, I don't think it's that young people want free stuff. It's that they're paying for everything. They are paying through the roof for college. They are seeing a political system that they feel like is bought, and they can't do anything about it. And I'm nonpartisan in general, and I'm not aligned in terms of the presidential campaign, but Bernie is speaking directly to these issues. He is saying exactly what they believe has been true that other politicians have been unwilling to say. But even if you're not going to make public universities free, you could still make it more affordable, right? Even if you're not going to overturn Citizens United on day one, you can still appoint Supreme Court justices who would view this issue very differently than the past majority on the Supreme Court. Even though you're not going to stop climate change overnight, you can put policies in place that will go a long way towards solving the crisis. And so I think it's always difficult for young people to try to think pragmatically. But even if you don't get 100%, 75% would be a lot better than the 0% that you're currently getting.
I mean,
On the mic, wait a minute, on the mic because it's being taped. Okay.
But if Sanders does not prevail, how do we keep these voters? How do we keep young people still engaged, because the only place for them to turn is to the establishment. They've not, their choices are now limited to establishment on the left and establishment on the right. So I'm just saying, where do those, can we keep those voters? Will they come back?
Can I add something to that for a minute? One of the things that I think we're missing, I mean, we're all looking at voting, but the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And so if I was a young voter and I elected Barack Obama for 4 years, and then I hear people say, the establishment say, well, really and truly, you only have 3 years. That fourth year, we're not going to count that, right? I mean, I'm ready to have a sit-in, right? Old-fashioned sit-in. So what happens to people who make a choice and then for 4 years to elect someone and then watch Mitch McConnell come out and say, you know what? We're not going to allow that. We are protecting the people. What do we do with that? Where do you take that energy? And how do you express it?
I mean, personally speaking, I really think you have to take the message to states and localities, but also apply pressure on your congressman and congresswoman to say, hey, I believe a Supreme Court justice should be put in place before the next election, because that's how things are just done, and then you're neglecting your right and your really bound duty to put someone in place. Do your job. Simple as that, right? So, that is a place where you could shift that angst. But I think, to play off of what Ari was saying, I think it's important for folks to not just focus on the presidential elections. Midterm elections are the things that really you see the serious drop off in. And I think a lot of emphasis is put on the presidential election, but really at the end of the day, the real things, the everyday things that are going to impact everyday life here are going to be impacted in midterm elections with your state reps and things like that. So in your gubernatorial elections and things like that. So in my work in the Senate, I've seen it firsthand. And to speak to Jason's point about how your reliable voting bloc pretty much dictates the work we do and the issues we address in Congress. I mean, you see, senior citizens have been more reliable as a voting bloc in the past. So what do we work on? Social Security, Medicare, et cetera, issues affecting the elderly. All important issues I work on and issues I care deeply about. But now the conversation has changed with, President Obama's popularity and presidential, campaigns. We've shifted the discussion on issues of criminal justice reform, on climate change, on, any number of issues that are now being addressed on the Senate floor and the House. And I think that's encouraging. I mean, this process, it may be slow and it might not be fast enough for folks in your community, but the more pressure you apply on your elected officials, the quicker it moves. And I can tell you that firsthand experience. So.
You wait for my sit-in. I'm going to be sitting down there.
Can I just add on this quick?
there with you.
Can I just add on this? Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, when we talk about the establishment, I think we talk disparagingly about people who have been in a process, but there is some good to the establishment, right? There is a process that exists to the establishment.
Maybe that'll be Hillary's message.
Right? Yeah. Well, what I mean by that, and bureaucracy obviously has a bad connotation as well, but what I mean by that is there are levers to be applied. Right, so those young people, in taking that message back to the state house, which is actually drawing those congressional boundaries. We're talking about gerrymandering districts. They have the opportunity to influence those elections, right? So it's not just if Bernie Sanders is not elected the Democratic nominee, they have nowhere to go. There are places to go where that voice can actually be heard and voiced and empowered, and that apparatus is the establishment, right? That is our political process. There are places for them to go and be engaged. But then there are also places for them to go and be engaged and influence that establishment process outside of the establishment. So, you can go and take your exercised effort to the ballot in different elections. But then there's also ways to access completely outside of the ballot where you're mobilizing. This is on social media. This is your sit-in. But what you're influencing again is that establishment, right? That's where the power is held, and so demanding that you be heard.
I just want to emphasize your point on the Supreme Court because I think every election cycle we talk about the importance of the Supreme Court, but it's very abstract to people. But I think this election finally, I hope that people get how important it is. And there has been a conservative Supreme Court my entire lifetime. I was born during the Burger Court, then we had the Rehnquist Court, and then we had the Roberts Court. And I think that, more than anything, has been the biggest detriment and the biggest obstacle to progressive change in this country. Because regardless of who is controlling the Congress, regardless of who is the president, you have center, right, or worse forces on the Supreme Court that loom over everything. And so I think that people need to understand the difference between a Justice Scalia and a Justice Sotomayor, the difference between a Justice Roberts and a Justice Ginsburg, and what that really means. This is the Supreme Court that gutted the Voting Rights Act. This is the Supreme Court that gave us Citizens United. This is the Supreme Court that is blocking Obama's executive action on immigration reform. This is the Supreme Court that has temporarily overturned the most sweeping climate change regulations issued by the president. So this is the Supreme Court that it looks possible, if not overturns Roe v. Wade, certainly keeps rolling it back. And so a lot of issues that young people care about are before the court right now, or have been before the court. And so I hope that the president talks about this every single day of his presidency from now to the end. If as looks like it's happening, if Senate Republicans block him, I hope he talks about not just the importance of getting a justice on the court, but what that justice actually does, why it actually matters, how people actually feel it in their daily lives. And then I hope that it becomes a central organizing principle of whoever the next president is. And so young people in particular can realize that they're not just voting for someone for a 4-year term. They're voting to put a justice on the Supreme Court for 30 to 40 years potentially. And that's the most transformative thing a president can do.
Makes my sit-in even more. Another question?
Hi, I am Denise Davison, and I am from Morgan State University, and I see my wonderful student over there, Khaliyl Gilmer. And I hope that she speaks up for her generation, because we have these discussions all the time in class. But I'm from, more importantly, I'm from a small town in the Midwest, where our policy is to vote early and vote often. Some of you all may know it. Chicago, yes. And so the political game is one of those things. But I say all that to say that I came to social work always with a thrust and a hunger for social justice. And so I know we're kind of talking back and forth and all around, but I really want to talk about what we've done to our curriculum and how we have shaped the profession of social work that has taken the social justice and the community organizing. I'm a graduate of SSA, University of Chicago, and I'm just trying to understand how we've made such a turn towards money and making sure that we do, and the clinical work is extremely important, please don't get me wrong, but how did we make such a sharp turn that we now taken this whole entire process, the policies that make the people sick, out of the conversation? That is huge to me. I also want to emphasize that women, I sit on the Women's Council, CSWE. Women are the biggest voting bloc, and women are the biggest number in the field of social work. So what have we done to our voice, and how did it get muted and sidetracked from addressing our best interests? So one of my mentors, who was also President Barack Obama's mentors, Emil Jones Jr. in Chicago, always told me, you vote your interests. Vote your interests all the time. And that's why I keep saying, how did we get away from this? My biggest thing with this whole thing is making sure also the history is put back into the curriculum in a meaningful way, where the students are able to find themselves, the theories reflect the women's voice also. I noticed everybody went down the line about the whole civil rights. Not one woman was mentioned. I must say that. I mean, those are just my observations. My observations. Because women are on the ground. We are the ones in the community at every point that you turn. We're there. And yet we're kind of like the background. Why are we always the supporting actors to what else is going on? So that's part of my issue. And of course, the digital citizenship, I love the hip hop generation. You know why I love them? Because they're bold. They don't care. They're like, I'm willing to die for something. It might as well be about what I believe in. They're not this scared. And if you watch that historically, it's always been the young people. Boldness. And that's what it is going to take at this point. So how about we support them in their boldness and stop asking them to be this respectability politics on the side. Just be quiet and be nice.
Now there were like 55 questions. So the skill of how to partialize is really critical. Obviously, we'll go to your efforts at Nancy Humphrey.
Well, let me just say that Khaliyl and I are both graduates of the UConn School of Social Work, and I came to the school because of Nancy Humphreys, because this is what she's taught and preached. She has spoken about political social work her entire career. She has mobilized voters. She has infused it in our curriculum. So I always thought that we were sort of the norm in our school until I realized, because we have a very strong macro program, and so I thought that that's what it was. Now, so I'm sort of new to academia, so I can't speak to anything, but I do know the tension in our community of social workers between this community action and our social justice roots and sort of direct practice, when it's really should be this. There is no difference. We talked a lot about this yesterday. What I will tell you about the curriculum is that we have always worked to teach advocacy at UConn, and embedding this voter education piece into a required course is new, and that's what we're trying to understand. What are the barriers to doing it? Because there is a lot of resistance. So we're doing a heavy evaluation effort. We're looking at field. We're looking at students. Why are they so reluctant to go out and engage in doing this work? And then the other thing we do is I teach a political social work class, and we have a campaign school for social workers actually running on Friday and Saturday. And the first 2 days of the class is really all about electoral systems. I mean, we go into this, and you know, the answer is always, I had no idea. I had no idea. And so it's incredibly empowering. I think it should be a part of what we learn, and you know, I know I'm preaching to the choir.
Khaliyl?
So I am a social worker, a proud MSW from UConn. Cheers to that. And, you know, to answer your question and to put it, I guess, in a short and simple way, I mean, I've never written a curriculum. I'm not a professor, but I have been a student my entire life, and I consider myself a student even now in the Senate. And just hearing what you said made me think one thing. Educators like you are the folks that are making the difference. I mean, you fired me up. I mean, I really enjoyed what you had to say, and I'm envisioning you in a class saying that to your students, and that's what starts. I mean, look, she's here, and you know, so that's so important to this cause. I mean, that we have people that are agents of change, that are in the classrooms, on the ground, having these conversations. You know, she was my professor, and you know, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her and her teaching. So, and her passion too, which is something that I think gets lost in the curriculum these days. So, you know, I think that's important that we have the right educators in there. And I think in social work, we've kind of let society tell us what our role is in the community. We've let folks say, hey, well, you know, you're a social worker. Aren't you supposed to be working in casework and, you know, direct practice and things like that, and all critically important to our communities. But I think one of our greatest strengths is our versatility and our range. We have an ability to impact all sides of the spectrum. So we can go upriver and upstream and impact the policies that impact the folks that are working downstream. And I think that's important for us to hear as social workers. I mean, I should not be a unicorn where I work right now. I haven't met an MSW yet, but I'm challenging you folks to come on board, and let's focus on the macro issues as well as the micro issues. And let's not let society tell us how to do our jobs, because we know what the issues our folks are facing. So, yeah.
I think that it was
many great points that you made, and I think I'm glad that you talked about the women of the movement, because that is something that I write a lot about in my book. Not just people who are more well known, like Rosa Parks or Fannie Lou Hamer or Barbara Jordan, but I tell a story in my book about a 94-year-old woman in North Carolina named Rosanelle Eaton. And her story is very relevant today. She was an African-American woman born in Jim Crow, North Carolina, and when she turned 21, she wanted to register to vote, which was something that very few African-Americans were able to do in the 1940s, North Carolina. So she took a mule ride, 2 hours, to the county courthouse. And there were 3 white male registrars there. Usually they would have just flunked her without even allowing her to try to register, but they told her to stand up straight and recite the preamble to the Constitution from memory. She did that, and then she also passed a written literacy test as well and became one of the first African-American voters in her county in North Carolina. And she voted for 70 years. She personally registered, she said, 5,000 people before she lost count. And then when North Carolina passed a strict voter ID law in 2013, she realized that the name on her driver's license did not match the name on the voter registration rolls because she got married and her name changed, which is a problem that a lot of women had. And not only that, but she was born at home in the segregated South, so she never had a birth certificate to be able to change her documents easily. So over the course of a month, in January 2015, she made 11 trips to different state agencies to try to get her documents in order so she'd be able to vote. 4 different trips to the DMV, 4 different trips to the Social Security office, and 3 different trips to various banks. 11 trips in 1 month for someone who passed a literacy test in the 1940s and had been voting for 70 years. So I think when we talk about voting, we need to hold up those sort of stories so people can understand the obstacles that people are facing, but also how persistent some people are. And what's fascinating about North Carolina is that really is one state where you have seen a legitimate movement arise in opposition to the conservative policies there, the Moral Mondays movement. And when I talk to younger activists there, they all know the story of Rosanelle Eaton. They all cite the story of Rosanelle Eaton. And so if they're not learning it in the classroom, they're getting it through real-world experience. And it's been fascinating to cover the voting rights movement in North Carolina because people are so inspired by the history that came before them. But that shows me that people have to know the history, right? They have to teach the history. And we're not teaching the history in schools. Sometimes when we are teaching it, we're teaching it in very disturbing ways. The textbooks in Texas now describe slavery as a positive social good. They celebrate General Lee's birthday, but not Martin Luther King's birthday. Lee King Day, but the Lee is always emphasized over the King in many places. So I think that is some of the stuff that's going on now that we have to counter. Yeah.
Now, this is what happens to educators. You see the lines getting long, the time's running short. There's a young lady over here.
Hi, my name is Monet Johnson, and this is Morgan Young. We are both current students at North Carolina A&T State University, and we want to thank Dr. Henderson for allowing us to be a part of such a wonderful event. We do have a question and a statement. We want to know, what can we do as current students for our peers to understand the weight of the significance of voting and not just the generic, I guess I could say, version of it? So what strides can we take in order to get them to understand that it affects them as well?
Sure. So again, with the millennial perspective, and what I saw that was successful in my experience at UConn, we had rallies. We engaged the community, not just the social work community, but the surrounding neighborhoods, and we were doers, more or less. We would set up tables like this outside of Department of Social Services to say, hey, so-and-so is voting in this fashion. This will not work out well for the current, services that you need right now, and handed out pamphlets and made sure folks were informed. I think just having a face in the community is important. In terms of reaching younger folks, you have to speak their language, and if anybody in this room knows how to speak their language, it would be you. So use the platforms that have been successful in the past, in the recent past, rather. social media and things like that. Also, and try to engage again on current events and dig in a little bit and try to make things transferable. So, I mean, again, that's a billion-dollar question, but I firmly believe that millennials really do care about these issues, especially when they're kind of relatable. So.
Just one story to piggyback on something you just said. I'm directing a documentary right now called The Quince Orchard Project. It's about a community in Maryland through the perspective of my grandmother. And sitting down with her and hearing her story, she told me about this one-room colored schoolhouse that was built and erected in 1868. And it so happened that my great-great-grandfather was one of the folks that helped buy that property and build that school. And when she was telling me the story, I stopped her and I said, whoa, 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 whoa. You know, 3 years after the end of slavery, you're telling me that this was a good idea, a safe idea for a couple of recently emancipated men to build a schoolhouse right on the main drag of town, you know, and acknowledge and announce to the world that they're trying to educate the community. And she stopped me back and she said that the black children in the community needed a school. And she said that my great-great-grandfather and those other men looked around and they saw that need. And they were doers, and doers do, right? This is an incredibly profound statement, so simple, but doers do. And I realized, right, that they didn't, there may have been some paralysis by analysis there, but it wasn't too much. They didn't think about sort of all the ways that that idea could fail, and there were many. They didn't think about the arson that would ultimately come, and then ultimately lead to a rebuild. They realized that there was a need in their community, that they needed to be the ones to act. And so, as Khaliyl just said, they were the doers, right? And you are the doers. The fact that you're realizing that need in your community, now it's for you to act, right? And there are many different actions that you can take, and we can't tell you exactly which one is going to be the most successful, and you have the ability to determine that. But what's most important is that you do, that you be present, that you be seen, and that you meet your students where they are and sort of push them in this direction.
Can I add one more thing? I also encourage you to work with your administration, because students really have, administrators listen, and you can push it. I mean, when you talk about, one thing that Ari talks about in his book extensively and that has mobilized our school is the disenfranchisement of formerly incarcerated people. I mean, you know, 1 in 13, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Ari, but I think it's 1 in 13 black men has lost their right to vote. And if you look at Florida, Kentucky, and Virginia, it's 1 in 5. So, I mean, those are really powerful statistics and can often also motivate people to get involved.
Yeah, I mean, you're in North Carolina, which is in many ways ground zero, and you're at A&T, which is a school with a tremendous amount of history. So I don't think it should be that tough. I know that there are people there on the faculty, people like Derek Smith, people that went to the school like Tyler Swanson that have been very, very engaged. So I think you're at the perfect place to use that activism because of the interplay of the state's current predicament and the history to really make your voices heard across the state.
I think we have time for one more question. Is that, or Charles? A couple more? All right.
A couple more? Okay.
Right.
Then I will make mine real quick because I know there's a student standing next to me who I want to give the microphone to. Mary Jo Monahan with the Association of Social Work Boards. I don't have my regulators hat on. I have my educators and my not-for-profit person hat on. And I'm so encouraged by what you're talking about getting schools of social work and not-for-profits together, because the not-for-profits are located in the communities and can do exactly what you're talking about. When I was in Florida, I was the CEO of a family service agency. We did voter registration in our organization. We were throughout all of Pinellas County. And also when I was at the University of South Florida, I brought voter registration into the university and was able to advocate that as a social work issue and brought it into the classroom. So I encourage all of us, these are the things that we can do as social work educators and the heads of not-for-profits. Got to work with those boards at the not-for-profits, though, because sometimes they have the pushback on we can't get political.
It requires a lot of buy-in.
About millennials.
Your name.
Oh, hi, I'm Luis Roberto Machuca. I graduated from Hunter College. I'm a proud MSW. About millennials voting, I think it's important when it comes to millennials to just be simple, and voting is a right. And I was taught to not relinquish my right to vote. Yeah. So whether it's Bernie, Hillary, Trump, or whoever other crazy person from the Republicans, I'm not saying that I'll vote for Hillary, but I'm saying that I will vote. And it might be writing, I might write in my name or Jennifer Lopez, but I will never relinquish my right to vote. And so, about the other thing, I wrote my capstone paper was an advocacy model based on human rights, and I found a term about political clinicians, which is people that would be able to understand the administration of government and use it to do individual and systemic advocacy. So how can we encourage, speaking solely about social workers, through, say, continuing education, continual education, and millennials to not just discuss current topics, but for professionals, especially clinicians, to engage personally and their clients and communities into not just voting, but also public policy.
Well, I think there's a whole lot of potential here to engage social workers on this issue, and one of the things that Charles and I have talked about doing is creating a professional development CECU kind of course where you can focus on a lot of these issues, whether it's nonpartisan voter engagement, which also includes the education and outreach piece, but also, you know, there's whole topics that haven't been explored. I mean, you know, we're heavily weighted right now in the clinical world, but there's a lot that we could do to educate the field, I think, through professional development.
Okay.
I mean, just to add a quick answer to that as well, I think there's, and something we use in Congress is there's touch points, right? You have these places where you might have a client come in and meet with a social worker, and this is where it would make sense to have another nonprofit NGO come in and maybe run a briefing on the importance of policy in their communities. So they do it with taxes to get people to understand the importance of taxes and things like that. These are touch points to say, like, okay, maybe you should start thinking about retirement now. Let's invest in your 401k. Let's set one up. So I think as social workers, we have folks coming into us for access to resources, so let's take that to the next level and have partnerships in our community with these nonprofits to say, hey, all right, well, we have the folks you want to reach. Let's set up a time, maybe brief, something simple. Millennials like simple. I know that. They say we're a soundbite generation, but I don't believe that either. But, I mean, honestly, I think there's touch points there, and I think there's ways in which we can be more effective in making these things come to fruition. So.
Okay.
My name is Johnny Hamilton Mason, and I'm a faculty member at Simmons College School of Social Work in Boston, which is a clinical school of social work. So I'm really, really happy to hear that the response of the panelists really addressing the three branches of the government and how they work, and that our exercising influence hits, if we hit one or focus on one, then that hopefully influences the whole system. But the other piece of that is that every change in one part of the system creates a reaction in other parts of the system, and we're talking about the historical sort of evolution of both the gaining of access to power and also losing the access to power. So that's one of the challenges that I face as a faculty member and an educator. And I have spent lots of time coming to DC every year. I bring my clinical practice class to DC to focus on health policy, because one of the things that has been really, really important to them and educational for them has been the ability to understand how policies are not colorblind, right? And that they have to exercise their role to influence their organizations or nonprofits that they work in. So I, as someone who's not a millennial, who really tries to relate to the millennials, I think that I need to hear something about how we can sustain the efforts and the energy, because I'm hearing you all refer to that in some way, that there's we have the need to look at state government and influence state policy. We're focusing on the federal election, and then all of the changes are happening and reversing in the state. So how do we collectively, as social work educators and professional social work practitioners, continue to use our role as being so involved with clients to keep the movement going and not lose the energy that happens. So that's, I know that's a big question and a long one.
That's a long one. I can see these professors are getting to do their lectures right now, right? The other two with the question, and then we'll finish. Okay, all right.
Yeah, my name is Moya Atkinson. I'm an old person, glad to be alive and kicking and full of beans. I read an op-ed in the Washington Post in April of 2014 by a social worker, and it shook me to the core, and that's why I'm here. It's to do with solitary confinement and the role of social workers as people who work within the units. So in October of 2014, I got a group going, and I'm the convener now of social workers against solitary confinement. I'm concerned, don't clap yet because I haven't finished. I'm concerned because I've been taking this message to the National Association of Social Workers. I was the executive director of the Maryland chapter of NASW for nearly 10 years, from 1993 to 2002. I have not found an open door, and I'm really concerned about the process within the profession itself, because I do not feel that it is open. I don't think it's really listening to the constituents. We're not allowed to be attending at the board meetings except the annual board meeting. The National Ethics Committee is not interested in the issue of social workers and the role and the ethical concerns of an association and what support it can give to the social workers, as well as to the 80 to 100,000 people in solitary confinement, including youth, children. And some of you have heard of Khaliyl Browder. So I'm here really to plead for the NASW National Association to open its doors. It's hard for us even to get our voices heard to the representatives. We have to go through one person who goes through the president. There's just so much about it that feels wrong, and I speak from my heart. Thank you.
We're going to take all of these and address them. So we'll be back.
Hi, Tara Breitsprecher. I'm the Government Affairs Director for the Pennsylvania chapter of NASW. And one of my major roles is mobilizing our social workers to advocate for the profession and for the populations we serve. And I find it's fairly easy to get our social workers involved. You know, we bring 1,000 social workers to the Capitol for Advocacy Day. We say, we need you on this issue. They're picking up the phones and calling if we ask the right ways. But I'm finding that it's difficult to move from getting our social workers involved to staying involved. And if it's not an issue that there's going to be a vote on this week, and when it's this week, they'll do it. But we know the value of relationships, but I'm finding that social workers they don't seem to be applying it to their legislators and understanding that that relationship is essential. And a lot of the votes that we've gotten, or the sponsors that we've gotten on bills, are the social workers who've stayed in contact with those legislators. And Tanya, I know you mentioned the one legislator said she hadn't been contacted for 6 months, and I know I've heard the same stories. And if we can bring the communities together, they'll speak up, but it's creating those opportunities that we're finding a difficulty with. So any advice to helping to create those opportunities and demonstrate the value of those relationships with legislators as well.
Okay, this is it. The last question. No, you need to apologize.
Hi, I'm Alexis Lyles, and I attend Virginia State University, and I would like to thank Dr. Henderson for letting me attend. A question, it kind of ties back into their question back there. I'm also part of the younger generation. I just want to know more so, how do we get the younger people to vote, even though they have the knowledge, and the ones that don't have the knowledge but have the motive?
Well, I'm going to tell you, I require my kids to vote. So that's the one thing. My children have to show me the ballot if they want some money.
I'll jump in. Yeah. Take some of the pressure off you, the millennial. I'm a quasi-millennial. And I think one of the things that we need to be very careful of when we talk about millennial population or any population is that there's a single solution, right? When we talk about the 50 years of effort that are outlined in Ari's book, there's not one strategy that's being deployed there. And so we need to recognize that across the country, across these communities, across the largest population, potentially soon the largest voting bloc in our democracy, that there are going to be different strategies that are going to engage these populations. And so we need to look at what those different strategies are. And I think that that principle applies also to your social work population. You've got some folks that are going to be moved to engage with legislators on a regular basis. You have some folks that are going to be moved when that vote is important. And I think it's really important that we don't fatigue our populations, our constituencies. You need to understand that some of those folks you need there for the big votes and some of the folks you need there for every vote. And so thinking through strategically which of those populations that you need and where you're going to engage them and empower them. And then I think just going back to the millennial population a little bit more, there's going to be, the history at A&T that's going to move a population. And that history may not be present or as personal or as motivating at another community, but there's something else. That might be the fact that there is felony disenfranchisement in that particular community, and that's a mechanism that's going to move those young people. Or it's the fact that something else that's particular and germane in the community where I'm doing my documentary, there's a number of high school students that have become civically engaged because of that history. It's personal to them. They feel it, and because of that, they want to get back engaged with their community. And once they do that, they see that there's the opportunity for them to continue to create and engage and do more work. And so I think we don't want to fall into the trap of assuming that there's one thing that's going to move this entire millennial population. There's different things regionally, geographically.
Just realize that we have many generations. We have the silent generation, those that are older. We have the baby boomers, the millennials, the X's, the Y's, and we have the Z's. Those are my little grandson. So I think that what is critical and what I've heard is understanding your history. You do not repeat your mistakes. I don't care whether you're an educator or whether you're associated with an organization. There's politics in everything. There's politics in our home. There's politics in organizations. It's how you are persistent to bring about change. And I think that that's really, really critical because so often we get tired. People get tired. So they want to say, well, how are you going to do that, right? The real reality is, how do you constantly stay engaged at the level of where you'd like to be engaged? It is time to pass torches on to all the different generations and allow and look at your boards. Do you have young people on them? That's where the political process starts. Allow people to come in and to engage, and when they speak, don't get in like, oh, we did that before. Listen differently. I'm very hopeful because as you talked about your grandparents, we all have stories and that we all know that are back here. So what I hope that we have learned here today is look at this panel. The work that they're doing. There's a lot of social workers, and Ari and Jason, you're our partners. But there's other professionals as well that we work with because interprofessional and how to bring and rise things. But there is the community. You were born in a hospital, and you have the ability to always do something. When I was young, my father made us do the call list. If we wanted our allowance, we had to do the call list for my father. Are you going to go vote today? And that was on an old rotary phone. So if we can do that, you all can do this. And I just want to say thank you and allow each of you to just kind of summarize or have your points. But I don't want people to get frustrated. I think what you said, there's many ways to solve a problem. But it's when you see the problem and you say there's barriers, and then you don't do anything. But there's ways to climb. Just get into the Olympics.
Hard to follow that up, but no, I mean, in terms of sustaining the conversation, it's again making it relatable to millennials. And I think the percentage it's 45% of millennials are either of an ethnic group or a minority. So, like to Jason's point, there's going to be different ways to approach different segments of society, and I think that's one of our strong suits as social workers. So, I kind of ask the question to you: how will you impact this group, or how will you target that group? And I think that in having different ways of attacking the issue is important. In terms of solitary confinement, which is an issue that I think Congress has taken up, and it's really something that will be a topic of conversation moving forward. I mean, I personally have been impacted by it in my own life. I've had brothers that were submitted to that kind of treatment, and it's completely arcane and barbaric. And I don't think, as a civilized society, we can really continue this kind of treatment to our American citizens, because at the end of the day, they are citizens, and no matter how much folks want to forget about that. And I think, in terms of changing the way we look at politics in general, I think it's important, again, to get back into the educational aspect of things. Teach folks about political inequality. Teach folks about issues that are affecting their communities. I mean, to trace back to your Chicago roots, Saul Alinsky's rub raw folks' resentments. Let's make sure we're having these conversations early and often. And I think you'll notice change might not come in a day, but it'll come, incrementally over a period of time. And I've really enjoyed this conversation. This has been incredibly enlightening. And I mean, it's always fun hanging out with our social workers. I'm going to say that.
I'll be quick. First, I want to say how honored I am to be on this panel with all these people. I think Ari's book should be required reading, and I guess I'll give a quick shout out to all the faculty out there. I think it starts with us making a commitment to bring this to our schools and bring this issue to our faculty. And then, in terms of sustaining engagement with students, the best thing to do is to get them doing it. They're not going to be inspired by a textbook. They are going to be changed. I'm so proud I'm here with 11 students from the University of Connecticut, our associate dean here, our former dean. I mean, we have a commitment, and I think every time I hear them or see them, after having gone through the process of meeting with Khaliyl, going to offices, meeting with their legislators, testifying, those are life-changing experiences, and they will be more involved from it. So doing is better than anything else you can do. So thank you.
I'll keep heaping that praise. Thank you for the work that you guys are doing. I may not be a social worker, but I am a community organizer. I'm the son of a minister and an educator, and so I was bathed in this idea of service, and that's what we all do, right? Service is love, and the service that you're providing is so important. I encourage you not to grow weary or tired on your journey, because it's an important one. And I think what Tanya just said is really important, that you guys really are incredible examples. I'm thinking to my friend over there from Baltimore who isn't sure that the young people are hearing her. Well, I remember, only reason I became a lawyer is because, someone in my past, a teacher, told me that I'd make a good one someday. And I didn't obviously move on that for many a year, but to this day, it stays with me, that someone saw a light in me that I didn't necessarily see in myself. And so when you tell those stories, when you educate your young people about political activism, community and civic engagement, and you don't see that immediate response, they hear you. Continue to share those stories, continue to educate, and continue to provide those opportunities for empowerment, because it's through that continual work that we'll see that engagement, we'll see voter, we'll see the incremental change that Khaliyl was talking about. That's the only way that change has ever come. So thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for letting me be a part of it.
Thank you so much for making me an honorary social worker. I'd like to think that sometimes being a journalist is a form of social work in and of itself these days, and this has been a fantastic conversation, and one of the fun things about having a book is getting to talk to so many different communities and learning from them as well. And I love the point that the graduate of Hunter College made. What was your name again? Louise. That voting is a right. Because you're absolutely right. Voting is a right, but we've historically treated it much more as a privilege than a right. And so I think that the root of all of this is understanding that the vote is a right. And that, as Charles said earlier, that voting is not just social work, but that voting is activism these days. And in some places like North Carolina, voting is even an act of civil disobedience. And so I know all of you guys are probably 100% voters. You're all very, very engaged. And so the change can start with you and then can move elsewhere. And you're in the position to inspire many, many others and get many, many people voting. And the vote's not going to solve everything. What Martin Luther King said is, the vote isn't the ball game, but it gets you in the stadium. It's the right that makes all other rights possible. So we have a whole lot of work to do, but this is the first step. So thank you.
And I just want to take time to thank all of you, as well as to thank each one of you. We know that you had to get up and either get on the metro or hustle over here early in the morning, and that already shows your commitment. The time is now. There's no time to go ahead and ponder and process. I know social workers are the most processing people, but it's the time to act is now. So this feels good. So we can have a groundswell when we go out here of knowing that everybody's committed to one thing. Number one, voting, and helping others to register to vote. Thank you.